Bom dia a todos. É um prazer recebê-los para assistir à conferência do professor Stafford sobre a teoria da causalidade nas ciências e no crime, que é patrocinada pela Cátedra Ford, que é uma das cátedras do Instituto de Estudos IEAT, UFMG, que tem nas suas atividades 4 cátedras. Uma é essa cátedra sobre violência da Fundação Ford e 3 cátedras financiadas pela Fundep sobre as demais ciências. Ciências da vida, ciências da natureza, artes e humanidades. É um prazer receber o professor Stafford. Foi indicado pelo CRISP, aqui representada pela pesquisadora do CRISP, a Corinne Rodrigues, que vai fazer a apresentação rápida do professor Stafford, em nome do CRISP e em nome do IEAT. Eu apenas vou um pouco difundir a tarefa do IEAT dentro da universidade. O IEAT, Instituto de Estudos Avançados Transdisciplinares, ele foi institucionalizado no ano passado, então é um órgão muito recente. E sua tarefa é basicamente providenciar a conexão entre as várias disciplinas e o diálogo e a contaminação entre os vários saberes, no sentido de prospectar um novo conhecimento, um novo saber realmente universitário, que envolva essa migração, essa tradução, essa contaminação entre as várias áreas de conhecimento, como é solicitado pelo século XXI para abordar a complexidade dos problemas que se colocam. A gente tem, além dessas cátedras, a gente tem várias atividades, tem conferências que são dadas, palestrantes nacionais e internacionais, a gente tem os encontros transdisciplinares, que são encontros entre professores da UFMG, de vários campos disciplinares, destinados a debater um tema. Então, esses encontros eles são mensais e a gente, esse ano, está se dedicando a essa conexão entre arte e ciência, o diálogo entre arte e ciência. E em breve nós teremos outras atividades, né? Nós teremos provavelmente mais 2 cátedras, uma cátedra sobre estudos brasileiros e uma cátedra sobre estudos latino-americanos, sempre nessa ambiência do transdisciplinar, ou seja, daquilo que está além das disciplinas. A transdisciplinaridade ela não é apenas os vários discursos disciplinares. Por exemplo, se eu vou falar sobre a cidade, aí o sociólogo faz um discurso, o biólogo faz um discurso, o engenheiro de tráfego faz um discurso, o arquiteto e o urbanista fazem outro discurso, o economista faz outro discurso, junta aqueles vários discursos sobre o mesmo objeto e, por exemplo, faça um livro. Isso não é a tarefa do IEAT. A tarefa do IEAT é colocar o diálogo entre esses campos, alterar metodologias, contaminar, como a gente disse antes. Daí o termo transdisciplinaridade, aquilo que está além das disciplinas. A gente já, nesse ano, nesses encontros transdisciplinares, a gente já fez 2 encontros. Eu convido a todos a participar. É fundamental que, dentro de uma universidade que queira dar, além de um conhecimento técnico, um conhecimento universitário, que a gente não se restrinja aos nossos nichos do campo de saber profissional ou disciplinar, mas que a gente vá além e tente conquistar uma certa cidadania ampla, cultural e universal, como está sob o nome universidade. Então, uma das tarefas do IEAT é providenciar os mecanismos dessa cidadania cultural E a gente vai ter, então, no dia 24, próximo, quarta-feira que vem, um novo encontro trans, aqui nesse mesmo auditório, para o qual todos estão convidados, sobre o que é ser culto hoje. A gente vai contar com a presença do Alfredo Gontijo, professor da Física, do Takahashi, professor da Matemática, e do sociólogo, professor do Departamento de Sociologia, Paulo Henrique Osório Coelho. Então, no dia 24 de maio, junho, provavelmente na Casa do Baile, aqui na Pampulha. A gente já contou aqui entre nós, além desses encontros trans, esse ano, o professor David Miller, com a conferência dele realizada na Fafiche, Argumentos e Cálculos, algumas diferenças cruciais, e o professor Joe Lambert sobre histórias orais, digitais. Então, é isso, né? Além do dia... Então, nós temos a seguinte programação. Dia quarta-feira que vem, o que é ser culto hoje, próximo encontro trans. No dia 20 de junho, Cidades amanhã, provavelmente na Casa do Baile, acompanhado do lançamento de um livro sobre isso, feito pelo IAT, pela editora da UFMG. E já adianto que no dia 7 de junho, também dentro dos encontros trans arte e ciência, a palestra Fantasia e Rigor, com o professor José Cabral da Arquitetura, Deise Leitur da Belas Artes e Ângelo Machado, professor aposentado do ICB. Agradeço a presença de todos e passo a palavra para a Corine apresentar o professor Mark Stafford. Muito obrigado a todos.
Bom dia a todos. É com muito prazer que o CRISP se envolve nesse projeto da Cátedra, porque o CRISP também é uma organização, é um instituto que entenda que a questão do crime é complexo e precisa dessa abordagem transdisciplinar. Então, temos muito prazer de estar participando nesse Cátedra, é a segunda visitante que nós temos, o segundo visitante que temos aqui, participando justamente nessa cátedra, e eu gostaria de falar só um pouquinho sobre quem é o professor Mark Stafford. O professor Mark Stafford é um professor formado em Sociologia, que atualmente é professor do Departamento de Sociologia na Universidade de Texas, em Austin. Ele tem publicado extensivamente na área de crime. Os seus trabalhos anteriores têm se enfocado muito mais na questão de homicídio e entender os mecanismos do homicídio. Recentemente, ele está trabalhando com 2 projetos. Um projeto, especificamente, querendo entender os fatores que levem à reincidência dos ofensores de crimes sexuais, e o projeto conjunto conosco aqui no CRISP, que é sobre a distribuição intraurbana da criminalidade. Nós queremos entender quais são os mecanismos que levam a criminalidade a ser diferente nos diferentes espaços urbanos. Tá? A nossa indicação do professor Mark Stafford, além do nosso interesse de um projeto em conjunto, vem também da nossa certeza que ele cumpre muito bem esse papel de cátedra transdisciplinar, né? Por ser uma pessoa que, nas suas pesquisas, busca, né, de sair da disciplina da sociologia e entender como que as outras disciplinas trabalhem na área que ele está interessado e quais seriam os mecanismos e metodologias e conceitos que iriam além né, da disciplina para melhor entender o fenômeno. Tá? Então, nós temos muito prazer de ter o professor Stafford aqui conosco e, sem mais, eu gostaria de passar a palavra para ele.
Eu só queria agradecer aqui a Lucinéia, a Eliane e o Leandro, que fazem parte da equipe do IASH, que produz tanto com tão poucos recursos, com tão pouca gente. Muito obrigado.
Bom dia. Unfortunately, that pretty much exhausts my knowledge of Portuguese outside of ordering meals or saying good afternoon or good night. So I apologize for my ignorance and appreciate your endurance of my English and the translation. I very much appreciate the opportunity to be here. I thank those at EOCH and those at CRISPy. I spent a year, quite some time ago, at the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford University, and I very much like that transdisciplinary experience. As Dr. Rodriguez said, I very much enjoy stepping outside of sociology and incorporating the work of other disciplines into what I do. I sometimes wonder why there isn't more transdisciplinary work among people in universities, and it's probably, honestly, that it's an enormous amount of work to do so, and I admit that sometimes I'm overwhelmed by what I find in disciplines outside of sociology, but I very much acknowledge the importance of that. I would like to single out Dr. Rodriguez and thanking her for all the work that she's done in making my trip an enjoyable one. I am very much impressed with the friendliness of Brazilians, and I've commented to many people about that Brazilians are much friendlier than those in the United States, and I hate to admit that, but it's very much true. In trying to decide how I could best show my thanks to everyone for the hospitality that they've shown me, I decided to go ahead and adopt the Brazilian World Cup team. So go Brazil. To more important matters. What I want to talk to you today is something I've been very interested in for a long time, and most of what I have to say I'll go ahead and read to you because I think I can get it over to you much more efficiently and more quickly in the process. Virtually all criminological theories are causal in that they focus on variables purportedly responsible for crime. Some crime theorists eschew the term cause. They substitute such terms as influences, or leads to, or affects, or determines, or structures, or prevents. The list is very long. Creates, depends on, brings about, increases or decreases, results in, is due to, produces, and forces. And there are still others, but I won't bore you with them. It's important that criminological theories are causal because non-causal or covariational theories lack policy implications. One of the principal reasons to construct causal theories in the social sciences, whether they're about crime or any outcome variable, is to apply them. That is, to use them to identify effective intervention policies for individuals or for populations. In the case of crime, the idea is that if X causes crime, whatever X might be, then we may be able to identify an intervention to effectively change X, thereby reducing, if not eliminating, crime. Criminological theories tend to focus on multiple causes, as do theories about most other outcome variables in the social sciences. There's recognition of multiple causes and theories outside the social sciences as well, including the experimental sciences. However, in theory testing in the experimental sciences, the effects of particular causes can be separated from the effects of other causes through randomization. For example, if W, V, and X are purported to be causes of Y, the independent causal effects of X can be estimated by randomly assigning cases to values of X, manipulating X, and then observing the values of Y. Randomization will help to ensure that the effects of W and V on Y are controlled, leaving only the causal effects of X on Y to be observed. Randomization is often impossible in the social sciences, and this is especially true when it comes to tests of criminological theories. For example, if a theory attributes law-breaking by juveniles, what we call juvenile delinquency, to such causes as child abuse, parents' divorce, and school failure, it's impossible to randomly assign juveniles to abusive and non-abusive families in order to estimate the independent causal effects of child abuse. Without the possibility of randomization, tests of criminological theories usually rely on statistical controls or partialing of variables with multiple regression or some similar statistical technique. However, applied statisticians have long questioned use of these techniques for drawing causal inferences because of the need to make strong a priori theoretical assumptions that cannot be checked or validated. Among the more important for testing criminological theories, use of these techniques assumes that the causal effects of a set of variables are first uncorrelated with the effects of left out causes, and two, that the causal effects of a set of variables are the same across all cases. The purpose of this paper is to examine these kinds of assumptions and other issues about constructing and testing theories of crime causation. This is done by considering 4 types of crime causation, the first being causal versus spurious effects, the second being independent versus shared effects, the third being reversible versus irreversible causes, and the fourth being basic versus superficial causes. Then attention shifts to the issue of causal homogeneity, which presents an especially serious challenge to constructing theories of crime causation. This paper is more epistemological, that is methodological, rather than ontological, out of a belief that attention to a wide range of epistemological issues can improve criminological theories and provide a systematic basis for more effective intervention policies. While the causal factors that I consider lend themselves mainly to quantitative considerations, causal inferences are no less problematic in qualitative criminological research. However, those problems are different from the ones that challenge quantitative theory and research in criminology, and thus are beyond the scope of what I would like to present today. I need to make reference to at least a few definitional considerations, but I will be brief. There's no accepted definition of cause. And for those of you who have read on the topic, you would understand how much of an understatement that is. Many people believe that any attempt to define cause or causation is destined to fail. I have no desire to join that argument here. I have no particular desire to joust with Hume or Kant or any of the followers of those two individuals, including modern philosophers of science. For my purposes, H.L.A. Hart, who's an eminent or was an eminent legal scholar, his definition will suffice. He defines cause in this way. He says, a cause is essentially something which interferes with or intervenes in the course of events, which would normally take place, so as to change that course of events. As such, a cause is different from both a necessary and a sufficient condition. Suppose that a fire results when someone drops a lit cigarette on combustible material. Although oxygen in the air is a necessary condition for a fire, normally we would not think of it as causing the fire. Instead, we would think of the lit cigarette as the cause. Now suppose that a man shoots another man and kills him. Although deprivation of his blood cells of oxygen is a sufficient cause of the man's death, we would not tend to think of it. Excuse me. We would not tend to think of it as the cause. Instead, we would think of the shooting as causing the man's death. Although deprivation of blood cells of oxygen is a sufficient condition for death, we're more interested in the cause of death under circumstances which call for an explanation. And the last part of that was a quote from H.L.A. Hart. Because discussion of causal issues can be clarified by referring to concrete illustrations, I want to describe to you today some of the research that Dr. Rodriguez and I have been conducting using data collected from students in Belo Horizonte. The research uses survey data by researchers at CRISP from over 3,500 5th through 11th grade students in 65 schools in Belo Horizonte and the surrounding metropolitan area. The surveys were administered in classrooms by research assistants who informed students that the surveys were anonymous and that no one from the school would see their responses. Teachers remained in the classrooms, but they completed teacher surveys while the student surveys were being administered. To measure delinquency, which is one of our principal foci, students were asked to self-report about whether they had ever, first, brought a firearm to school, second, brought another weapon to school, third, been involved in a gang fight, fourth, stolen in school, and fifth, committed robbery. They also were asked whether in the past 3 years they had hit anyone in school. The response options were none, 1 or 2 times, 3 to 5 times, and more than 5 times, and responses were added to construct a delinquency scale. Similarly, a drug scale was constructed by adding students' responses to questions about whether they had ever tried, first, alcohol, second, cigarettes, third, laughing gas, fourth, marijuana, fifth, solvents, sixth, ecstasy, seventh, ingestible drug or injectable drugs, eighth, cocaine, and ninth, crack. The response options were never tried and tried for each of those types of drugs, with 0 representing never tried and 1 representing tried. In the U.S. and many other countries, such self-reports of law-breaking are widely considered more accurate than police and court records for measuring delinquency and drug use. One of their key benefits is that they allow researchers to collect data from both non-offenders and offenders, including offenders who have never been caught by legal officials for their crimes. The Belo Horizonte self-report data are among the very first collected in Brazil. The key independent variable is religious denominational identification, which sounds very complex, but it's really a very simple kind of variable, measured by asking students whether they were Catholic, evangelical, other, which included spiritualist or espírita, or no religion. Dummy variables were created for each type of religious denominational identification So for the Catholic variable, students were coded 1 if they were Catholic, 0 if not. For the evangelical variable, they were coded 1 if evangelical, 0 if not, and so on. No religion was omitted from the analysis as a reference variable. About 50% of the survey students were Catholic. About 33% were evangelical. And about 10% said they had no religion. According to a recent Brazilian census, Catholics make up about 75% of the total population in Brazil, and evangelicals make up about 15%. So the distribution of religious denominational identification of the students was slightly different from that among Brazilians as a whole. The other independent variables were included in the analyses as controls. Age is a continuous variable ranging from 10 to 17. There are 4 race dummy variables: black, mixed, and other race, which included indigenous and mixed race students, and other mixed race students, I should say, with white being the omitted reference variable. Gender was dummy coded with 1 for males and 0 for females. Work is a dummy variable created from students' responses to a question about whether they worked for money. And gang is a dummy variable reflecting whether students currently belong to a gang, 0 being no, 1 being yes. To measure socioeconomic status, or SES, each student was given a list of 14 types of household items and services, including radios, televisions, video cassettes, and DVDs, air conditioners, computers, and household help, and asked how many there were of each type in his or her household. So a student might have answered 2 radios, 3 televisions, 1 computer, and so on. An additive scale was constructed from the standardized values of the 14 variables. Parental involvement is an additive scale constructed from students' responses to 3 questions about the persons responsible for them, usually parents. The first, they were asked, over the last 12 months, did the person responsible for you, first, go to school meetings, second, help with homework, and third, participate in school activities open to the community? The response options were never, sometimes, and always. Although I'll report on it, the analysis also included dummy variables for each of the 65 schools as controls, with one of the school dummies omitted as the reference variable. Table 1 reports multiple regression results for some of the independent variables. I hope that you're able to, especially those of you in the back, are able to see the table. I've omitted a great deal of the findings in order to make this large enough for all of you to see. So I've abbreviated the findings very much in this particular table. The table shows you for both drug use and delinquency unstandardized regression coefficients, or what I've labeled here as lowercase b's, and standardized regression coefficients, the italicized capital B's, for each of the independent variables that I've shown you, along with their significance levels. Since the purpose here is not to discuss what predicts delinquency and drug use, but rather to examine causal issues in criminological theory and research, a brief summary of findings will have to suffice. Students who identify themselves as Catholics and evangelicals reported significantly less delinquency and drug use than students who identify themselves as having no religion, which was the omitted reference variable. In contrast, students who self-identified with a religious group other than Catholic or evangelical did not differ significantly from the no religion students in their self-reported delinquency and drug use. These findings are similar to what's been found in research in other countries, including the U.S. I'll describe some of the findings that we were able to generate, other than those that I've listed here on the table, but I'll do so even more briefly. Age was not significantly related to delinquency, but it was significantly positively related to drug use. Hence, there was more reported drug use among the older than the younger students. Only 2 of the 6 race dummy variables were significant. Black students did not report significantly more delinquency and drug use than white students. Mixed race students reported significantly more drug use than white students, but they were not significantly different from whites in their self-reported delinquency. Other race students reported significantly more delinquency than white students, but they were not significantly different from whites in their self-reported drug use. Males reported significantly more delinquency than females, but they did not report significantly more drug use. Working for money, gang membership, and socioeconomic status, or SES, were significantly positively related to delinquency and drug use, and parental involvement was significantly negatively related to drug use, but not delinquency. Like the findings about religion, these findings are similar to what's been reported in research in other countries. I deliberately avoided causal terms in my summary of findings, which was often difficult to do. However, consider the statement that being Catholic or being evangelical caused students to commit less delinquency and use less drugs than identifying with a religion, or than not identifying with a religion. Of course, that only begs the question, why or how is being Catholic or being evangelical negatively, causally related to delinquency and drug use? An answer provided by U.S. researcher Evans is representative of the kind of causal theoretical answer often provided. He says that some denominations broadcast proscriptive moral messages, inculcating their members with moral values that inhibit crime, that is, cause them to refrain from committing crime. Observe that when a causal term is used in one part of a theory, causal terms are often used in other parts of the theory. However, other causal issues arise immediately, one of them having to do with the distinction between spurious and causal effects. In a recent review of similar research, Johnson and his colleagues caution that multivariate analyses are necessary to draw acceptable, and that's his term, acceptable causal inferences about the relationship between religion and delinquency. Such cautions are standard in the criminological literature and reflect a belief that the relationship between any variable and crime might be spuriously attributable to other variables. That is, the relationship may be non-causal. Such a belief is ostensibly why many researchers control for such demographic variables as age, race, gender, and socioeconomic status, or SES, in analyzing criminological data. Such demographic variables could be causally related to crime and its covariates. In the case of the religion-delinquency relationship, it's believed that such variables as work and parental and peer influences may be sources of spuriousness. For example, religion and delinquency may be related only because both variables are caused by involvement of both parents in the lives of their children. If this is the case, as conventional reasoning goes, the regression coefficient for Catholic and evangelical, the regression coefficients for Catholic and evangelical should not be significant when parental involvement is included in the multivariate analysis. According to this reasoning, the findings I summarized should give researchers the confidence to conclude that there is a causal relationship between religion and delinquency. However, such a conclusion may be erroneous. One reason is omitted variable bias. Even if a statistical analysis includes a wide range of variables as controls in order to detect spuriousness, it's possible that the true source of spuriousness is omitted from the analysis, perhaps because it's unknown. There's no statistical technique, however sophisticated, that can identify an unknown source of spuriousness, since that is a theoretical, not a statistical issue. The more general issue is summarized by Clogg and Heritou, who say, if it can be known with certainty that a model about the relationship between X and Y is causally right when Z is included and causally wrong when Z is omitted. However, even when it can be assumed that it is a cause of the outcome variable, there are other important causal issues regarding independent versus shared effects, reversible versus irreversible causes, and basic versus superficial causes. Looking first at the notion of independent versus shared causes. As I mentioned before, criminological theories are usually multivariate, and researchers often attempt to identify variables that are independently causally related to crime. That is, do not share causal effects with other variables. To illustrate, consider a very simple theory that crime is caused by both race and socioeconomic status, or SES. Since race and SES are likely to be associated, a statistical analysis may show that neither is independently related to crime. This may be a reason why the race coefficients in the Belo-Horizonte research mainly were non-significant. Among Belo-Horizonte students, SES was positively related to being white and negatively related to being black and mixed race. Hence, the race variables could have been non-significant when SES also was included in the multiple regression analysis. In fact, this was not the case. The race variables were not significantly related to delinquency and drug use when considered apart from SES or any of the other independent variables in the analysis. However, even if a variable is not independently related to an outcome variable when other variables are considered in a statistical analysis, the variable may be no less important to consider. Saccone gives an example of a statistical analysis of the relationship between race and uncounted election ballots in the 2000 US presidential election, which shows how shared effects sometimes are more important than independent effects. You all may have heard the little story about the 2000 presidential election in the US where we were led ultimately to count ballots. There was a great deal of controversy about the counting of those ballots, hanging chads and all of these kinds of things. We learned new terms in the US as a consequence of this recount. But Saccone says, if one were able to estimate a regression model which showed that there was no relationship between the race of a voter and her probability of casting uncounted ballots, when one controlled for a long list of covariates, it would be unclear what one has found. Before any regression is estimated, we know that if we measure enough variables well, the race variable itself will be insignificant. But in a world where being black is highly correlated with socioeconomic variables, it's not clear what we learn about the causality of ballot problems from its showing that the race coefficient can be made insignificant. Similarly, Marini and Singer illustrate how researchers may be interested only in what they call the disjunctive plurality of causes that may produce an effect. If an individual is identified as having high susceptibility to several causes of death and dies shortly thereafter, this information offers some explanation of why the individual died, but does not single out the actual cause of death. It may be irrelevant to know which of several possible causes produces the effect. Many theorists ignore the distinction between independent and shared effects, choosing instead to let researchers disentangle the issue. But most theories of crime causation would benefit from explicitly recognizing that most causes of crime are probably shared. For example, in his strain theory, Robert Agnew argues that among individuals, delinquency is caused by anger and other negative emotions that are in turn caused by negative life experiences. These negative life experiences include such things as child abuse, failure in school, divorce of parents, and loss of a girlfriend or a boyfriend. It may be interesting in an abstract sense to learn which negative life experiences are independently related to delinquency. However, many negative life experiences co-vary, as when an abused child also fails in school, and this makes them no less important as causes of delinquency. Moreover, in the case of policy applications, it would be incredulous to address only those negative life experiences that are independently related to delinquency and drug use and ignore the rest. Turning to reversible versus irreversible causes. As I've indicated previously, it's important that criminological theories are causal because of their potential policy applications. However, causes lend themselves to effective intervention policies only if they're reversible, and it's likely that many causes of crime are irreversible. There are at least two ways that causes of crime can be irreversible. Some theorists posit that the causes of crime are immutable. For example, according to Gottfredson and Hershey, crime is caused by low self-control, coupled with criminal opportunity. Low self-control forms in early childhood as a function of ineffective parenting, and according to Gottfredson and Hershey, is immutable after that. Intervention cannot increase people's self-control, according to Gottfredson and Hershey, and thereby decrease their propensity to commit crime. Similarly, Moffat argues that neuropsychological impairments, which can be inherited or caused by such factors as maternal alcohol and other drug use, poor parental nutrition, and brain injury, can all cause persistent offending across the life course for some offenders. These life course persistent offenders, as she calls them, have poor verbal skills and weak self-control, and, most important here, cannot be rehabilitated, according to her. There's another way that the causes of crime can be irreversible. If an increase in X causes an increase in Y, my favorite theoretical example, by the way, then X is a reversible cause of Y if a decrease in X also causes a decrease in Y. Now, because of the abstract nature of that, let me just read it to you again more slowly. If an increase in X causes an increase in Y, then X is a reversible cause of Y if a decrease in X also causes a decrease in Y. However, if an increase in X causes an increase in Y, then X is an irreversible cause of Y if a decrease in X does not cause a decrease in Y. There are many examples of this kind of irreversible cause outside of criminology. Among populations, or for any population over time, the incidence of lung cancer increases when many people smoke. And it decreases when many people stop smoking. Smoking, of course, being a putative cause of lung cancer. Hence, smoking is a reversible cause of cancer at the population level. However, at the individual level, smoking is an irreversible cause of lung cancer, since cessation of smoking will not eliminate lung cancer among those who acquired lung cancer from smoking. Though, of course, cessation of smoking will reduce the likelihood among smokers who have not yet acquired lung cancer. So among individuals, the cause of lung cancer is different from what causes its cure. Hence, among individuals, the cause of lung cancer is irreversible. Uggan and Pilioven, two U.S. researchers, argue that a similar situation exists with crime, that the reasons why people initiate crime are probably different from the reasons they may later desist from it. Moreover, they argue that it may be easier to translate causes of desistance into effective intervention policies. And they say, our ability to isolate the true causal effect of critical etiological factors, such as parents, schools, and neighborhoods, is constrained by our inability to manipulate the selection mechanisms guiding their allocation. For both social scientific research and policy purposes, manipulation of these factors is unacceptably invasive in a democratic society. The researcher conducting a desistent study has a more legitimate and expansive license to intervene in the lives of participants. Our Belo-Horizonte research shows how a cause of crime may later become a cause of desistance from crime. In particular, recall that I reported work among students was positively related to delinquency and drug use. In this sense, work may cause Belo-Horizonte students to commit delinquency and use drugs, but their later desistance may be caused by work or work-related variables. Turning to basic versus superficial causes. According to Stanley Lieberson, social scientific theories, including theories of crime causation, have tended to focus on superficial rather than basic causes, partly because of adopting an experimental science model in sociology that relies on studying variation. Speaking of the classic image of Sir Isaac Newton sitting under the proverbial apple tree, Lieberson argues that social scientists probably would identify something other than gravity as the cause of the apple's fall to the ground, because gravity is not a variable quantity, at least in earthly situations. Used this way, the meaning of basic cause for Lieberson is akin to Aristotle's formal cause, which involves the very essence of a thing. Theories of crime causation have not totally ignored these kinds of basic causes. Perhaps the best example is Robert Merton's theory of anomie, or theory of normlessness, which states that crime in the United States is caused by a combination of a basic and a superficial cause. The basic cause is adherence to the American dream, which according to him is a goal universally shared by people in the United States. The superficial cause is the opportunity to achieve the American dream, which some people have more than others. There's little wonder why researchers have tended to focus on the superficial cause more than the basic cause, because the American dream is a constant that falls outside the scope of conventional research methodologies. It's likely that many causes of crime, many basic causes of crime, are variables, not constants, and hence do fall within the scope of conventional research methodologies, at least in principle. The caveat's important because there may be serious methodological problems with incorporating variable basic causes in testing theories of crime causation, even though it may be possible to do so in principle. An example comes from Sampson and Loeb's life course theory, in which they argue that certain life experiences, such as marriage or gainful employment, will cause offenders to desist from crime or at least reduce their rate of offending. However, suppose that both marriage and desistance from crime are causal effects of a desire to change. The problem is not that marriage and desistance from crime are said to be spuriously attributable to a desire to change. In fact, this illustrates my previous point that not all spurious relationships can be dismissed as unimportant. The problem is that a desire to change is very difficult to measure, and hence to incorporate in tests of life course theory, even though it's a basic cause and marriage is only a superficial cause. With causal homogeneity, in an ideal situation, the causes of crime would be the same across all populations. So if X causes crime in one population, say among US residents, then X would cause crime in all other populations, say among Brazilian residents, as well as among residents of all other countries. However, the situation is far from ideal. For example, among the Belo-Horizonte students, the relationships between religious denominational identification and delinquency were stronger among those in public as compared to private schools, and among those in religious as compared to non-religious schools. Hence, there was evidence of causal heterogeneity rather than homogeneity. The findings for the Belo Horizonte students reflect the simple fact that the relationship between two variables, be it a causal or a non-causal relationship, may be contingent on a third variable. However, heterogeneity in the causes of crime is often much more complex than this. For example, I've found that for the U.S., there's a strong positive correlation over time between the unemployment rate and the homicide rate. However, the situation is very different when the data are disaggregated by state. There's a strong positive correlation over time between the unemployment rate and the homicide rate for some states. There's a zero correlation for other states, and there's a strong negative correlation for still other states. Moreover, there's no obvious variable to account for the heterogeneity in the correlations. Even if there was some way of accounting for the heterogeneity, it would provide little help in formulating intervention policies. Should the unemployment rate be intentionally decreased in some states to lower the homicide rate and intentionally increased in others? Heterogeneity in the causes of crime can be complex in another way. As indicated previously, Dr. Rodriguez and I found that socioeconomic status, or SES, was significantly positively related to delinquency and drug use among the Belo Horizonte students, which is to say there was more self-reported delinquency and drug use among upper SES students than among lower SES students. Although this finding is contrary to the popular belief that there's more delinquency and drug use among lower SES youths, it's consistent with evidence in other countries, including the U.S., about the association among individuals between SES and delinquency and drug use. However, this is not to say that the relationship between income variables and crime is consistently positive across units of comparison other than individuals. There's considerable evidence among U.S. states and among countries of a strong negative relationship between crime and such income variables as the percent of families that live below the poverty level and income inequality. The situation is not one where the causes of crime differ from one population to the next. Even for the same population, the causes of crime may differ from one unit of comparison to the next. It may be useful to consider an analogy that involves the washing of hands. Even if there is a causal relationship among individuals in a particular country between hand washing and disease, there may be no causal relationship between the two variables among cities of the same country. It's not that one of the causal relationships is right and the other one is wrong. They're just different, and that difference should bedevil theorists, researchers, and policymakers. I'll share with you today a related paradox that has bedeviled me over the years. Self-report surveys, as the one that was conducted among the Belo Horizonte students, have consistently shown either a weak positive relationship between SES and delinquency or no relationship. In contrast, victimization surveys, which are similar surveys except they ask people about their victimization experiences rather than their offending experiences. Victimization surveys show a negative relationship between SES and the likelihood of victimization, just the opposite of what offending surveys tend to show. Moreover, police data show higher crime rates in lower SES parts of cities. So, how can all of this happen at the same time? Well, I should hasten to add that no one really knows. This is just an accepted paradox for which we're seeking an answer. But I'll give you some hypothetical data which might provide an answer, and if not that, at least will illustrate the complexity of the problem. I emphasize these are hypothetical data. These are data that I've made up. And the data were constructed along the lines of several things we know about delinquency and other kinds of deviance, as we call it. But there are some unknowns that I've incorporated in this table, and I'll alert you to that when I get to them. Let's assume that in a particular population, there are 120 middle-class offenders, 120 middle-class people who have violated the law, and there are 80 lower-class offenders, 80 lower SES persons who have violated the law. This is roughly the kind of pattern that Dr. Rodriguez and I found in the Belo Horizonte data. More delinquency, more law breaking among the lower, or among the upper, I have to get this straight, more delinquency among the upper SES students. Now assume, just to make things simple, that each offender has committed only one offense. Obviously, the situation is more complicated when we begin to consider that most offenders commit more than one offense. But for illustrative purposes, simply assume that each of these offenders has committed one offense. Now, at this point, I introduce an assumption or a possibility about which we really know very little. And that assumption or that possibility is that middle-class offenders tend to violate the law in 4-person groups, and that lower class or lower SES persons tend to violate the law in, on average, 2-person groups. What I'm really asking you to assume here, or asking you to consider, is a possibility that middle or upper SES offenders violate the law in larger groups on average than do lower class or lower SES persons. Now, part of this assumption is based on fact. We know from a great deal of research stretching back really over about an 80-year period now that most young people, when they violate the law, do so in groups. Most often they do not violate the law alone. So when they commit burglary, they tend to do it with other persons. When they shoplift, they tend to do it with other persons. For the vast majority of offenses, most juveniles violate the law in groups rather than alone. So this possibility reflects that. What we don't know, though, is anything about average group size. So I'm simply considering the possibility that middle class, middle SES persons violate the law in larger groups than do lower SES persons. If that assumption or if that possibility holds, then in order to calculate the number of offenses calculated by or committed by middle class versus lower class persons, we simply take the number of offenders, each of whom has committed one offense, and we have 4-person groups. So we don't have 120 offenses for those 120 offenders. We in fact have 30 offenses. To illustrate the point, I often ask my students to tell me, what they did the previous night. And I say, suppose that each one of them tells me they committed burglary. I hope that's not true, but they play along with me nonetheless. I then inform them that it's possible that there are as many burglaries as persons in the room. So say that there are 100 students in the room, each one committed burglary the previous night. It's possible that there were 100 burglaries committed. However, if they all committed the same burglary together, then there's one offense. So this is the kind of logic or approach that I'm adopting. We do the same thing with the lower class offenders, the lower SES offenders. We find that since they're violating the law in smaller groups, they generate more offenses. So we have more offenses committed by lower SES persons than by delinquency or no relationship. Yet victimization surveys and police data show the opposite kind of pattern, that SES tends to be negatively related to crime and law-violating behavior in general. When the police respond to crime, there's no doubt that they're responding to offenses. They learn about offenses, not offenders, at least initially. And so they equate crime and offenses. Self-report surveys, as I've described the results from the Belo Horizonte survey here, they tend to focus upon offenders rather than offenses, and that's an important distinction to make. but it might help you to understand the complexity of the causal relationships that we're trying to disentangle here. If there are questions about this later, I certainly invite you to ask them. Let me offer a few brief conclusions, because I don't want to take up all of your day. I could talk about this all the day, for all the day, by the way. We could generally ask, should criminologists abandon attempts at causal theories given the enormous complexities that are involved in considering causation? I believe the answer is no, and I believe emphatically no, because of the link between causal reasoning and intervention policies. All of us tend to think in causal terms. That's one of the reasons why there are so many synonyms for the word cause. We can substitute all kinds of words for cause to demonstrate the kinds of causal reasoning in which we all engage. Criminological theorists also engage in causal reasoning all the time, and that's important because causal reasoning is linked to intervention policies. I believe that instead of abandoning attempts at causal theories, we need to work even harder at developing or constructing causal theories. We need to work even harder at identifying causal relationships. Always bearing in mind, though, that causation is ultimately a theoretical, not an empirical notion, and hence is impossible to prove in any real sense. At the same time, theories of crime causation need to go beyond simple causal reasoning. They need to systematically address issues about independent versus shared causes, about reversible and irreversible causes, and basic versus superficial causes. I believe that ignoring such issues is a pathway to ineffective intervention policies and ultimately more crime. So in the end, I'm not trying to discourage anyone from considering causal issues in the study of crime or in the study of any issue that non-experimental scientists might address. I hope that what I've done is simply to impress you with the cautions that need to be exercised in considering causation in crime theories or in other kinds of theories, but at the same time encouraging you to go beyond simple reasoning. Causation is an extremely complex idea, and most of the time, admittedly, sociological criminologists approach the topic very, very simplistically. And so I'm urging that we all move beyond that, and I think by doing so, we'll be able to not only understand the causes of crime better, but we'll be able to generate much more effective intervention policies to address the problem of crime. I'll return to my favorite theme, Go Brazil, my new adopted World Cup team. But let me now turn the direction of the discussion for a moment and allow you to ask any questions that you might have of me or any comments that you might have to make. Should we? I'll leave Ronaldo up there.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the exposition. Eu vou deixar a coordenação das perguntas para Corine. Não sei, o Cláudio Beato quer vir para cá, dar uma coordenada e tal. Cláudio Beato, diretor do CRISP, com o qual eu tenho acordado as manhãs vendo as entrevistas dele para a CBN sobre o caso de São Paulo. Bom, a pertinência da palestra, é claro, né? Estamos aí, né, com esse problema de São Paulo emergente, então a gente vai passar a palavra para o público. Enquanto vocês pensam na pergunta, Cláudio, quer fazer alguma consideração, alguma coisa inicial? Corinho.
Eu acho que, inicialmente, aí, agradecer, né, a conferência brilhante do professor Stafford, porque, dentre outras razões, eu acho porque ele nos traz aqui uma forma, né, de abordar e procurar entender os fenômenos de criminalidade e violência que eu acho que crescentemente a gente teria que ter no Brasil, né, essa preocupação, né, muito acurada, por exemplo, para tentar entender as causas dos fenômenos, né. Infelizmente, essa é uma área que no Brasil nós, provavelmente, todo mundo sabe as causas de crime, né, e a gente está vendo que a discussão ela é complexa e merece justamente um investimento intelectual muito grande de pesquisa, no sentido de tentar compreender efetivamente o que está ocorrendo, né? Infelizmente, isso não é uma tradição ainda no nosso país, e um dos propósitos da Cátedra é justamente a gente pegar e trocar experiências, né, com outros países, universidades, professores e pesquisadores que já têm uma tradição de pesquisa, procurando, né, aprender, procurando intercambiar experiências, né? Naturalmente, são contextos bastante distintos, são contextos bastante diferentes, mas é fundamental essa troca de experiência para a gente tentar ver o que pode ser utilizado, o que pode ser, né, enfim, que tipo de ferramentas a gente pode compreender. E do ponto de vista, né, conceitual e teórico também, eu acho que a grande contribuição dessa conferência especificamente é mostrar justamente a complexidade, né, dos problemas relacionados à criminalidade e violência. Eu acho que esse é o início, vamos dizer, de uma tomada de consciência que a gente tem de tentar induzir, vamos dizer, no meio acadêmico, né, justamente esse tipo de pesquisa, né, e intercâmbio interdisciplinar, que é o espírito dessa cátedra, ou seja, buscar várias disciplinas para procurar compreender um fenômeno da complexidade da violência e criminalidade.
Obrigado. Eu vou abrir a pergunta apenas um pouco para dar curso à tarefa do IAT, que é a conexão entre saberes, né, Charles Mellman, talvez um dos maiores psiquiatras ainda vivo, faz uma conexão entre a criminalidade e a busca do gozo e do prazer a todo custo na sociedade contemporânea e desenvolve isso falando da perda da figura do pai, ou, no caso, né, da psicologia, mas no caso da perda da figura da lei nas sociedades contemporâneas. Então, no termo lacaniano, isso tem a ver com a perda da figura do pai, do nome do pai, que tem a ver com a perda do lugar da lei nas sociedades contemporâneas e o advento de uma ideologia do gozo ou do prazer a todo custo, que entra no lugar do próprio desejo e da própria felicidade. Então, eu só queria né, dar início a essas perguntas, colocando essa conexão um pouco entre lei, essa causa distante ou básica, como ele disse na conferência dele, que não é aquela causa imediata, superficial, né, só fazer essas conexões e abrir o debate. Só isso. Se puder fazer alguma conexão nessa questão da...
There were a couple of things I was thinking about as you were talking. There's been a great deal of research in the United States about the relationship between parental divorce and law breaking by juveniles. And the research illustrates the enormous complexity of this problem. Researchers from the early part of the 20th century, the early 1900s, found very clearly that children from so-called broken homes committed proportionally more delinquency than kids from so-called intact homes or unbroken homes. And so it seemed very clear that parental divorce was a cause of delinquency. As we moved, though, through the 20th century, researchers increasingly found a weaker relationship between parental divorce and delinquency, to the point where currently, if you had to offer a very general conclusion, it would be that broken homes do not cause delinquency, except in rare situations. Those rare situations being where divorced fathers are raising their children apart from biological mothers, and even then with girlfriends or live-in partners. Here's the complexity. Now, we could say that the research in the early 20th century was correct, and the research in the late 20th century is incorrect. It seems to be something different, though. That U.S. culture changed enormously over that 100-year period. In the early 20th century, divorce was very uncommon. Very few parents divorced. So kids in divorced families were unusual. And this seemed to create enormous stress or strain on children, perhaps causing them to commit delinquency. As we move through the 20th century, though, divorce rates increased in the U.S. to the point where divorce is not that uncommon among families anymore. It's not uncommon for children to be raised in so-called broken homes, single-parent families, or blended families, as they're sometimes called. And so there's much less strain on children in divorced families. In some ways, and I say this jokingly more so than anything else, but it illustrates my point. In some ways, there's strain put on children in intact families. And my wife is sitting in the front row, and so she can help me remember this, but my own children have often commented at Christmas usually about the problems of living in an intact family. What they're talking about, of course, is the fact that they only get one set of Christmas presents, or Christmas presents from my family and her family, and that's it. Whereas in so-called broken homes, especially blended families, there are multiple families from which they can receive Christmas presents. And so I get the idea their entire homes are filled with presents from these many family members. And my children complain and talk about the stress or strain of having been raised in an intact family. Again, I'm joking about this more so than anything else, but it illustrates the point that the situation has changed dramatically. One of the most difficult things to do in studying a crime or studying any sort of sociological phenomenon is to recognize that the causes of crime may change over time. Broken homes may cause delinquency at a point in time and not cause delinquency at another point in time. And so our policies have to change accordingly as well. It's not like the physical scientists, where the laws of nature are unchangeable. They remain the same for eternity, or at least so we think at the moment. But in sociology, it's a very different kind of situation. Our causal relationships are so contingent on other variables that as those situations, those conditions change, our causal relationships will change as well. So I was thinking about this as you were talking about the enormous complexity of considering the issue. Many of you have probably heard the idea that as you learn more, you know less. I'm certainly in that situation. That the more I learn about crime, the more uncertain I am about all its parameters. And so I'm much more cautious than I used to be about offering very firm conclusions about causes or policies or anything along those lines.
Thank you very much. Eu passo a coordenação dos debates aí para a Corina e para o Cláudio. Obrigado.
Bom, agora gostaria de abrir para quem tiver alguma pergunta. O Luciné aqui na frente está com o microfone.
Deixa eu puxar um pouco as perguntas aqui para o nosso contexto, quem sabe.
Bom dia a todos. Professor Marco, bom dia. Bom dia, um abraço aí à esposa do senhor também. E ao senhor. Muito obrigada por o senhor estar aqui fazendo esse trabalho com a universidade. Eu não sou da universidade, mas eu vi ontem pela televisão o convite para assistir essa conferência. Eu sou da comunidade, moro aqui próximo da universidade, e aqui estou porque eu sou uma cidadã 24 horas por dia e participo de vários movimentos, sou presidente de uma ONG, de uma entidade, em que o nosso objetivo é a defesa dos direitos do cidadão, baseados na nossa Constituição Federal. Então, ela tem uma abrangência, um trabalho multissetorial, e já em 93, quando ela foi fundada, a gente já antevendo que a transdisciplinaridade e a interdisciplinaridade, né, seria a tônica das instituições. Então, a gente já abriu para essa abrangência, né, e esse trabalho multissetorial. E parabenizar a universidade por esse trabalho, por esse olhar sistêmico, né? Eu acho importantíssimo para nós, da sociedade, que precisamos assumir a nossa responsabilidade social para com os outros. E muito importante esse trabalho que o senhor está fazendo, porque a gente está vendo pela exposição do senhor que por toda a história, né, o acesso aos bens culturais, né, aos bens de produção, é o que define a nossa condição humana. E também que tudo que a gente vivencia na infância tem a ver com o nosso comportamento em adulto, né? Então, acho muito importante que a pesquisa, que aprofundar né, uma forma mais científica, mais profunda de ver as causas da violência, para a gente é muito importante nesse trabalho que a gente vem tentando fazer, né? E como o professor Cláudio disse, nós já sabemos muito bem, as causas são N variáveis, e eu acho que precisa de ter um mutirão, um grande mutirão, né, de toda a sociedade, juntamente com as autoridades, né, até a nível internacional, esse trabalho conjunto, porque, como o senhor disse, as variáveis são muitas, e quando internacionalmente as coisas fazem restrições ao nosso país, de não investirem em políticas sociais, em políticas públicas, né, diminuindo o orçamento para combater a pobreza, as causas da violência. Então, isso é uma questão grave, que eu acho que tem que haver uma participação de todos nós somos irmãos. Eu acho que nós precisamos de diminuir os índices de criminalidade e defender as nossas crianças, os nossos jovens, porque, inclusive, na nossa Constituição, só para uma informação para o senhor, professor, os nossos constituintes de 1988, eles priorizaram os direitos humanos, os direitos do cidadão, do homem, né? Então, ela tem uma conotação, um caráter universal. E eles priorizaram de forma absoluta os direitos das crianças e dos jovens. Então, eu acho que nós temos um dever constitucional de defendermos as nossas crianças e os nossos jovens. E o senhor está aqui com a universidade fazendo um trabalho extremamente importante, e eu acho que esse trabalho deveria ser aberto à comunidade, às pessoas que participam desses movimentos, porque é um instrumento muito importante para todos nós. E eu agradeço muito à universidade e o senhor, professor. Obrigada.
Let me just say one thing that I was thinking about as you were talking. Criminological researchers, I think, tend to agree with what you said about the importance of poverty as a cause of violence. Today, I demonstrated some of the complexities in considering the relationship between poverty and violence. But I think generally it's safe to say there's an obvious relationship between the two. What's not obvious, though, is why there's a relationship between poverty and violence. And this is something I've been trying to do in other work through the years. It's not just as simple as saying that poor people automatically commit violence and rich people don't. There must be something about poverty that generates the violence. And as part of the problem, I should note that in the U.S., and I assume this is true in Brazil as well, women are poorer than men, and yet women have much lower rates of violence. And so that suggests at least some conditions under which poverty might cause violence. What I believe, and this is what I've been examining in my own research, what I believe is that what poverty reflects, or what's important about poverty as far as violence is concerned, is people's incapacity to control the events and things around them. And I understand that's abstract, but poor people have great difficulty affecting what happens to them. From whether the electricity is functioning in their homes, whether their toilets flush, whether they have toilets, whether or not they have reliable means of transportation to work, whether they have work, and so forth. They generally are much less effective in controlling what happens to them in their everyday lives. And this includes controlling other people in their lives. And I think it's this inability to control that helps us to understand why poverty might be related to violence. And I think it also helps us to understand why women, who are generally poor, commit less violence than men. And this is another lecture, so I won't belabor the point here, but violence is an interpersonal thing, usually. Violence tends to begin with an argument or a quarrel or a dispute that escalates into violence. And females, women, are generally better at interpersonal relationships than are men. And most importantly, in terms of soliciting the help of others to peacefully resolve a dispute. My favorite example of this is that I was asking someone if this is true of Brazilian men, and the answer was yes. It's certainly true of men in the U.S. When men in the U.S., such as myself, get lost driving around the city, we don't ask for help. This is the last thing we'll ever do, stop and ask for directions. We'll simply drive around aimlessly forever without soliciting the help of anyone. Women ask for help, and they're much more likely to find their way out of where they're lost. And this illustrates a more general point that women, females, even young girls are much more prone to solicit the intervention of persons to resolve disputes. We see this in schoolyards, in elementary schools. Two young girls get in a quarrel, and one of them, if not both of them simultaneously, will run to the teacher to try to resolve the dispute. When two young boys get in an argument, it often turns to violence. We don't tend to solicit the intervention of third parties. And this is a matter of control. We're not exercising that degree of control or empowerment, if you will, in terms of trying to resolve the problems we have in our lives. And so I think that you can use all of these control explanations to help us understand why poverty is important and why sometimes it's not important and so forth. But I believe that's important, if only because it helps us, it informs us what we ought to focus upon in terms of policy. It's not just poverty, but it's the empowerment of poor people and people generally, which I think is important in terms of preventing violence.
Temos algumas perguntas aqui que eu vou traduzir e dizer para o professor Mark. I'll give them to you one at a time. The first question is, some indicators localize determined types of crime in different regions. And the question is this a local characteristic or a world or international characteristic?
That's an excellent question. Unfortunately, I don't know the answer. It's obviously true to some extent. We know the causes of crime differ from one place to the next. At the same time, there do seem to be some causes that are universal, or at least found to hold in many places. One of the great things about educating students around the world is they tend to take the ideas and apply them, use them wherever they live. And so Dr. Rodriguez was one of my students, and certainly she was able to apply some ideas that were generated in the U.S. to help her understand some of the crime problems and social control problems in Brazilian favelas. I've had other students who are Arab, one Saudi Arabian student in particular, who tested this idea I described today, that religion is important in terms of preventing delinquency, and he found, as we did with the Belo Horizonte data, that indeed was the case. I was actually surprised that it was an important factor in Saudi Arabia, because I had assumed that religiosity would have been a constant, if not by choice, by requirement, that there was something that all people in Saudi Arabia had to be. They all had to be religious. Well, there was enough variation to be related to delinquency. So these kinds of things do tend to hold across place and across time. But undoubtedly, there are also many causes that do differ across place and time. And I mentioned with regard to broken homes or divorced parents in the U.S., this does seem to be something that's changed over time. So there's always this need for sort of constant reevaluation, constantly researching. We can never just find a relationship and assume that we can then accept that one and move on to the next. We can't assume that causal relationship will change. They do change. They do differ from place to place and change over time.
Okay. The next two questions are somewhat related, so I'll give them the same time. The first question is, can changes that have not been assimilated or are still unknown, can they be mechanisms to diminish violence? And then the second question is, if actual societies or recent societies are changing rapidly, and how does this affect the contours of crime and their relationship with these changes?
Again, those are very good questions, but very difficult ones to ask or to answer. It's of course impossible to incorporate factors about which we know nothing. There may very well be important causes of crime that no one has identified at this point, and there's no way we can incorporate them in research, at least in any systematic way. Fortunately, though, and maybe this is what the questioner was getting at, fortunately, so many of the variables that we study are interrelated. They co-vary so much. And so it's probably the case that we're studying unknown causes at the same time that we're studying causes. We just don't know we're doing so. And in a sense, this is one of the advantages of non-experimental research, that we are able to incorporate things we don't know simply by association. It's important, of course, at some point in time, if we can, to identify what those unknown causes are, but that's something that takes a very long time to do. With regard to the sort of second part of that, how changes affect what we do and what we study and so forth, I've emphasized that is extremely important, that there's no doubt that the causes of crime can change over time. And I'll give you a simple example. One of the things that I hear many people discussing in Brazil is the importance of income inequality, or the inequality of wealth in generating crime in this country. I have no doubt that is an important part of the crime problem here. I also have no doubt that there can be situations where income inequality can be unrelated to crime. Again, I think it's important to ask, what is it about income inequality that generates crime? Is it just a very simple fact that there are some people who have a lot and some people who don't have very much at all that generates crime, or what is it? Nations can address the problems of income inequality by providing programs, resources for the poor outside of raising their income levels. It may be that what's important about income inequality is not the inequality itself, but the resources that come with the inequality. And those resources can be provided by strong governmental programs. So conceivably, at one point in time, income inequality could cause crime, and at another point in time, not cause crime, because of government policies that somehow support the poor, that make those important factors that generate crime go away. And that, of course, is something that we could observe through research.
The last question would be, since the causes of delinquency can be varied, then what would be your idea of an attempt to lessen the indices of criminality or to lessen crime?
I'm confused. Did you?
if the causes of delinquency are varied, then what would be your suggestion or your idea as an attempt to minimize crime or to lessen crime?
Well, the idea, I should say the ideal situation, would be one where we would focus our intervention policies on the most important causes of crime. The only caution I would urge at this point is what I mentioned today, that some of the more important causes may be irreversible. And that's a very new idea to sociological criminologists. It's a very new idea to me. I think we've assumed from the beginning that all causes of crime are irreversible, that if we can identify the most important causes, we can eliminate those causes and crime will disappear in the process. That may not be true, at least in the short term. So, for example, poverty may be a very important cause of crime, at least at a population level. And yet the effects of poverty may not be reversible in the short term. They may be enduring because of the effects that poverty has on generation after generation of persons. And so our intervention policies may have to focus on other kinds of even less important causes of crime in the attempt to have some kind of impact at all. It's not to say that we should feel hopelessness in addressing a problem of poverty, but simply the recognition that eliminating poverty or reducing poverty in any meaningful sense may not have the immediate consequences that we would hope them to have. An example, again, is the U.S. Prior to roughly 1960, there was enormous income inequality in the U.S. And with President Kennedy and President Johnson, there was a well-publicized war on poverty. And there were great efforts to improve the situation of the poor. What happened, though, surprisingly to many people, and surprising to me as I look back upon it, was that crime rates increased during this period of time, not decreased. It was the exact opposite of what we had hoped to be the case. But it might show the irreversibility of some of the effects of poverty, that even when you improve people's economic situation, there will not be a reduction in crime immediately. It may be very long term. And I'm confident that Brazilian politicians are the same as U.S. politicians in this sense. Politicians, policymakers they're very myopic. They're very short-sighted. They do not appreciate the importance of long-term consequences. If something doesn't have short-term consequences, they don't want to have anything to do with it. And what I would urge policymakers to do, as well as citizens generally, is to think long-term, because some of these causes of crime may be impacted only in the long term.
Agora eu gostaria de deixar algumas pessoas no público. Temos uma lista de perguntas aqui, mas eu não gostaria também de excluir as pessoas que gostariam de perguntar diretamente. Então,
bem, na verdade, eu estava querendo fazer uma pergunta a respeito das variáveis dependentes, mas essa discussão aí, no final, ela é muito interessante, porque estou me lembrando do livro recém-lançado, A Elite da Tropa, que o Luiz Eduardo Soares, na obra dele, Capitão Pimentel, começa o trabalho justamente falando desse paradoxo. O tanto de gente pobre e honesta que você tem, ao mesmo tempo que o crime dos colarinhos brancos vem cada vez mais crescendo. O cuidado que a gente tem que ter com essa relação de causalidade entre pobreza e violência. Em relação à pesquisa, à categoria religião, eu queria perguntar assim, para vocês se existiriam possibilidades de dar uma refinada nas próprias categorias, nas próprias subdivisões dentro do termo relacionado à religião. Por exemplo, a divisão foi feita católicos, evangélicos e outros. Esses resultados apresentados para Belo Horizonte, eu não sei necessariamente se eles refletem uma realidade. Por exemplo, no Brasil, a gente tem um crescimento da religião espírita, recentemente, muito grande. Só que a maioria das pessoas, ainda em função de preconceitos, ou medo, ou relações que criam de espiritismo com macumba, umbanda ou qualquer coisa, preferem assumir a posição de católico. Então, assim, eu não sei se reflete necessariamente uma realidade. E outra coisa, será que pensar a questão da religiosidade para meninos entre 10 e 17 anos seria uma variável assim, extremamente significativa? Porque, diante dos resultados, parece que não necessariamente tem muita diferença. Porque você, no Brasil, hoje em dia, você praticamente, para os últimos 20 anos, a gente pensa que o crescimento evangélico também, você tem crianças que já nascem evangélicas, com os pais, acabam frequentando esse tipo de culto, né? Da mesma maneira, você, na sua maioria no Brasil, você nasce católico. Então, eu acho assim, a resposta católico, que é uma grande maioria, ela é uma coisa até meio automática. Muitas pessoas aqui provavelmente devem ter feito catecismo, ou primeira comunhão, mas será que, por exemplo, se você vincular essa categoria católico a católico praticante, ou ter algum tipo de vínculo que refine mais essa relação? Porque eu acho que a religião ela tem ela é um fator de extrema importância nessa questão da inibição da violência. E pensar que outras religiões, como o espiritismo e o evangélico, as pessoas que aderem a esse tipo de religião, elas já aderem a esse tipo de religião na idade adulta. É uma escolha que ela faz posteriormente. Então, eu queria saber assim, como que isso poderia ser pesado na hora de você definir variáveis, de maneira a trazer uma resposta para você mais condizente ainda com a realidade. Porque pode te levar a conclusões diferentes do que na hora que você classifica católico, evangélico e outros.
I agree very much with what you said. When Dr. Rodriguez and I began this study, using Claudio's data, I should add, I was convinced, and Professor Rodriguez or Dr. Rodriguez can speak to this, that I was convinced that we wouldn't find anything, because there had been a great deal of research on religion and delinquency showing that religious denominational identification, being Catholic, being evangelical, that wasn't terribly important for the reasons you indicated. That often it refers simply to a label. That in order to find religion to be important, we have to look more deeply at what we call religiosity, the extent to which people practice their religion. So as you said, people are sometimes born Catholic, and that may mean little or nothing about their degree of religiosity. So I was prepared to find that religious denominational identification, what I'm calling religion in this study, would be unimportant. So I was actually surprised at how predictive it tended to be of delinquency. There's no doubt that the measurement of religion is flawed, and honestly, I would have liked to have had religiosity information. However, usually, when a variable is so badly flawed as you described that it really tells us little or nothing about what's important in a person's life, usually in that kind of situation, it's unpredictive. The consequence is it won't be related to anything, because the answers that people provide are virtually meaningless. In this sense, the strong relationship between religion and delinquency would suggest that there's something there, that in addition to the error, which undoubtedly exists, that there is some mechanism operative among Brazilian youth, or at least among Belo Horizonte youth, linking religious denominational identification and their delinquent behavior. It could very well mean, for example, that being Catholic or being evangelical, on average, is a meaningful characterization of many youth. That undoubtedly it's not a meaningful characterization of all, but it does reflect something that's important in terms of linking it to delinquency. At least that is what I would conclude as a researcher. We would believe, though, that if we had even better measures of religiosity, we would find them to be even better predictors of delinquency. And I think that's what you were saying, and I would agree with you. If we could refine those measures, we'd find that these better measures would even better predict delinquency and drug use than they did. I was astounded by the fact that in terms of their predictive power, being Catholic, being evangelical was as important as being a gang member or being male, which in U.S. research, being male, being involved in some sort of law-violating group has been found to be most important. And so being Catholic, being evangelical, ranked with those predictors of delinquency. I was surprised, probably as you were too.
Mais alguma pergunta da plateia? Que eu tenho algumas aqui para ler, mas queria dar mais uma oportunidade à plateia também.
I'm a law student, and my question is related to that, because
That does confuse me, yeah.
Sorry. And I'm interested in criminal law, so I'd like to ask you if we can find the causes to a crime, but is any crime justifiable? I mean, should the causes of a crime be considered when the judgment is being formed? For example, even if all the reasons of a robbery or a murder come from a socio-economical state, hypothetically speaking, can this argument be used in court? And if so, what should be its influence on the punishment?
Mm-hmm. I'm not an attorney. I'm not a lawyer. And I recognize that those issues are often very different. In the U.S., some defense attorneys have tried to use some of these sociological variables as justifications, defenses for the commission of crime, and usually they failed. At least in our system of law, it matters little what causes it, as much as the very fact that a person has committed a crime. At the same time, researchers sometimes play a role in this debate, and I was reading some research recently on the different ways that people, jurors, judges, attribute responsibility, and that's an important issue. It's apart from what causes crime, but it's the degree to which they should have exercised a better judgment, let's say, in determining what they do. And I'll give you a simple example, the one that I was reading about. If a person parks a car at the top of a hill and somehow the car, the brake fails or the gears disengage and the car rolls down the hill, if the car smashes into a building, there's property damage. If that same car, though, hits a pedestrian and kills the pedestrian, of course, there's a personal injury. And in those kinds of situations, judges and juries will hold the person whose car resulted in the death of the person to be much more responsible. Even though it's exactly the same kind of situation, it's accidental, really. And yet, we'll hold the person who owns the car that killed the person more responsible simply because it did kill some person. And so we assume after the fact, this may not be fair in any real sense, but we do tend to after the fact, hold that person responsible in a different way than we would hold the person responsible whose car simply smashed into a building. And that's a very important issue for which researchers might have some input, but it's independent of the causes of crime. One of the things that interests me in visiting Brazil is learning more about Brazilian law and Brazilian criminal justice and comparing it with the U.S. I think U.S. criminal law is much more punitive, and we recognize many fewer defenses. And that's something that troubles me. I wish that we recognized more defenses, but we're in a cultural period in which that's simply not feasible. And so we do tend to hold offenders absolutely accountable regardless of the situation, most of the time. There are exceptions. And so it's important for me to see what's going on in Brazil, to learn what's going on in Brazil, to make these kinds of comparisons.
Eu queria mostrando um pouco como é que isso funciona no Brasil. Eu acho que no Brasil você tem uma longa, já que vem se estabelecendo crescentemente nas escolas de direito, é aquela coisa dos estudos críticos legais, que é vamos dizer, um tipo de abordagem que leva muito mais em conta esses aspectos, vamos dizer, socioeconômicos, né? Isso que você está perguntando. E, em algumas áreas do direito, ela tem se estabelecido, sim. Por exemplo, no direito do trabalho, né? Você tem alguma, mesmo, né, na parte civil, onde sistematicamente as ações tendem a ser em favor, vamos dizer, dos mais desfavorecidos aí, na situação. Isso tem ocorrido, né, em algumas áreas, e também na área criminal. Eu acho que há aí algumas vezes alguns juízes que ainda optam, vamos dizer, por essa pena, ou considerando, vamos dizer, as origens sociais e tal. Isso tem sido crescente, né? A despeito, vamos dizer, de você ter uma demanda de outro lado, mais no sentido americano, por ser uma legislação mais punitiva e mais, né, dura.
And I'll link that to one of the comments by the earlier questioner about white collar crime. Sociologists have known for a very long time that there's as much white collar crime as there is ordinary street crime, and that often the white collar crime produces more harmful results, even in terms of loss of life and personal injury and so forth. Many sociologists have tried to argue for the importance of studying that kind of crime. And I think within university settings, there's a great deal of understanding, appreciation for that. Outside of universities, however, there's much less support for that. In the U.S., people tend to associate crime with crime other than white-collar crime, what we call street crime. And they tend to see the white-collar crime as less important. And when you begin to look at critical studies of law and sociology, you begin to see more of this kind of discussion. But it really hasn't moved over to the actual practice of law and legislation as much as it probably should have.
Existe, né, um autor importante da sociologia, né, o Anthony Giddens, e que ele usa um conceito chamado reflexividade para definir, né, a modernidade, né, ou seja, esse estilo de vida chamado modernidade. E com esse conceito ele está tentando se referir, está se referindo ao fato de que nós, modernos, né, vivemos cada vez mais sob condições objetivas, né, que são frutos de... são consequências não antecipadas, né, de ações racionais e pensadas, né. Então, estava pensando, será que a gente poderia pensar, né, no crime, né, no fenômeno do crime, como sendo uma consequência não antecipada, não prevista de algum comportamento racional? E se sim, né, quais seriam esse comportamento?
There's several parts, I think, to your question. When Giddens talks about crime, and let's say violence in particular, as sort of a part of modern society, my response to him would be to encourage him to look at data. And granted, data are always less than ideal, but if we look at violence over a long period of history, it seems to be very clear that the amount of violence has tended to decrease with modernization and development and so forth. If you read historians' accounts, for example, of 15th century England, I mean, putting ourselves in that particular time and place, we would all be very scared, I think, because of the enormous amount of violence that occurred. Anthropologists have found this with pre-literate societies, that contrary to the idea of the noble savage, there's more evidence of the violence pre-literate, a member of a pre-literate society. I was telling Dr. Rodriguez yesterday, there's a New Guinea society that an anthropologist estimated every adult male has committed at least one murder, and often many more, but at least one murder. And so that gives you some sense of perhaps what modernization or development has done. There's less violence, it seems to be. This isn't to say, though, that there aren't conditions in modern societies that generate violence, and that even may fit what you're describing, what Giddens would describe, I guess, as rational. I do believe, and this is more a belief than something that I found in my research, but I do believe that much violence is more rational, strategic, instrumental than we often acknowledge it to be. We tend to see, we researchers tend to see violence as something that's irrational. It's something that people don't think out, that has no purposive quality to it. And I think it does. Donald Black, who's another sociologist, really a sociologist of law at the University of Virginia, has written about violence as a means of control. And I do believe there's something very important to that people exercise violence in order to control others. In domestic violence situations, for example, I think this is very clear, that domestic abusers tend to commit violence in order to control their spouse. The irony, if you will, is that often these attempts at control don't work. They just generate more violence. But they are attempts at control, and in that sense, rational, purposive, instrumental. And I think that's a very important way of looking at violence that many people have refused to do up to this point. They see violence as just something that's an irrational way of behaving. And I tend to agree with the idea that there's more rationality to it than we would normally recognize.
Uma pergunta lá no fundo.
Boa tarde. Quando você usou racionalidade, e eu fiquei pensando se essa racionalidade não poderia ser encaixada também na pergunta anterior, que diz respeito à impunidade, que aqui no Brasil é muito comum, dos crimes de colarinho branco. Normalmente, eu prefiro fazer uma ligação entre os crimes que não são punidos com a repetição deles. Isso não é, teoricamente, só de crime de rua, mas todos os crimes, todas as escalas de crimes e todas as escalas de sanção também, não se falando só de crime. O que você não limita, normalmente, é tomado como comum. Então, a banalização do crime que acontece em várias sociedades não seria uma causa, mas não seria uma forma de tratar o crime como uma forma não criminosa, mas aceitável para a sociedade, e essa evolução criminosa perder-se o controle desse limite. Não é uma causa do aumento e da grande locomotiva desgovernada que tornou a violência no mundo inteiro, de várias formas, desde as mais sutis até as mais visíveis, que são os crimes de rua?
If I understand your question correctly, I would agree. One of the things I've studied most during my professional career is deterrence, or the consequences of legal punishment on criminal behavior, and that's very much a rational choice kind of issue, as we tend to call it. I think there's a great deal of evidence to suggest that one of the reasons why white-collar crime occurs so much is that it often does escape legal punishment. And there are many reasons for this. There is a cultural bias in the U.S. and probably in many countries favoring the rich over the poor. So we tend to associate crime with the poor and ignore the crime of the rich. Even when we recognize it, however, it's very difficult to respond to. I have a childhood friend who worked for the state of Texas prosecuting white-collar crime cases, and he was telling me at one point that it would take years to gather enough information on some of these white-collar crimes to prosecute them because they're so complex. I had a college friend who was actually convicted of a white-collar crime a while ago, and I read an account of what he did, and I really couldn't understand it. It was very complex. All I could get from it was that he was a bank president. He took money here and put it over here and then moved it behind his back and between his legs and under his arms. And in the process, money kept disappearing. But I couldn't follow exactly what was going on because I'm not a tax accountant or not a tax accountant, but an accountant or any sort of person knowledgeable of these sorts of complex business transactions. And that's part of it. But I think that the difficulty of prosecution and the cultural bias that I described makes it very difficult to prosecute these cases. And undoubtedly, many people who have the opportunity to commit white-collar crime see it as something they can do with impunity. They believe they're not going to be caught, and probably in most cases they are not. So it's the kind of rational choice that they're making. They believe they're going to get away with it, and they do get away with it. That's something that they learn from personal experience as well as from observing others. I don't know what the solution is. I mean, it'd be nice to say that cultures ought to change to more severely condemn it. That's fine. But it's still very difficult to prosecute. It's different, say, than robberies and burglaries and so forth, at least for the very complex versions of these white-collar crimes, which trouble us the most. My wife and I were reading just yesterday or today that the so-called Enron case in Houston has gone to the jury. And of course, this affected thousands of people, losses of just enormous amounts of money. But the difficulty of prosecuting this has been obvious, and it'll be interesting to see what happens when the jury returns with a verdict and ultimately some sort of punishment is issued. What exactly will happen? I really don't know what to predict.
Pergunta lá no fundo.
Bom dia. Ao longo da sua apresentação, o senhor citou inúmeras possíveis causas de crimes. Eu esperava que, à medida que tais causas fossem descobertas, nós passássemos a entender melhor o funcionamento dos crimes e pudéssemos, consequentemente, evitá-los. Pelo que posso observar, porém, isso não está acontecendo em nenhum lugar do mundo. Para o senhor, qual é o motivo dessa inconsistência? Ainda não conseguimos levantar causas suficientes para entender os crimes, ou as verdadeiras causas ainda não foram descobertas?
It could be all of the above. I believe, though, that one of the things I commented upon is important in this sense, that we've tended to think that the causes of crime are the same things that ought to be affected in order to eliminate crime. And that may very well not be true. So, as with the Belo Horizonte data, we did find that working was positively related to delinquency. Kids who worked outside the home for money tended to report more delinquency and drug use than kids who did not. And that's something that's been found in the U.S. as well. I remember first reading such a thing and being very surprised, because in the U.S. we have this tradition of the Protestant ethic. Work is good. Young people need to work to learn responsibility and thrift and so on and so forth. And so the idea that work could actually cause delinquency was something that I found surprising. As researchers began to look at this more closely, it began to make sense. In the U.S., when teenagers, when adolescents work, they typically work in either fast food restaurants or in retail sales. And in both kinds of industries, they're working mainly around other young persons. Their managers tend to be young persons. They're not working around adults. And so it's not that they're being apprenticed to older persons who are teaching them responsibility and the importance of thrift and so forth. It's mainly just an extension of school and often in an unsupervised kind of situation. So here's an example of how work may cause delinquency, but then you turn it around later in life, work may be the reason why they desist from crime. And so it's a very clear example of how the cause of crime may be very different from the solution of it. And I think therein lies an important part of how I would answer your question, that we've sort of naively, simplistically assumed that whatever causes we identify can be translated into effective policies to eliminate it. And that may not be true very much at all. The cause of desistance may be very different from the causes, from what causes crime initially. And I'll simply add, it has been pointed out by critics for some time that the causes of crime that researchers have examined are often very difficult to affect, to change. And poverty is a good example. If let's say poverty is the only cause of crime, and it is something that if it could be eliminated, crime would be eliminated as a consequence. As we all know, poverty is something that's very difficult to eliminate in any society. And so the focus is on a cause that is very difficult to change. And researchers, I think, need to recognize that, take that into account, and somehow identify causes that are more changeable, that are more mutable. How we do this, I don't know. I simply pose it as an idea, because I have no idea how you would actually measure mutability or changeability of a cause. But that may be something we need to consider in the future.
Vou ler alguma.
Provavelmente quem descobrir a causa definitiva do crime ganha um prêmio Nobel, assim, imediatamente, né? Eu tenho uma questão aqui a respeito de uma das causas de crime que eu gostaria de, enfim, na verdade são duas questões, e uma delas tem a ver com esse contexto nosso. Existem estudos nos Estados Unidos pelo professor Stephen Levitt que mostra que uma das maneiras de intervir que reduziu drasticamente o crime, né, e tem muito a ver com a nossa discussão aqui, foi o encarceramento, as taxas de encarceramento crescentes nos Estados Unidos. Isso seria um dos responsáveis pelo declínio da criminalidade observada lá nos últimos anos. Essa é uma política que foi adotada aqui, que explica um pouco o que a gente está observando em São Paulo. São Paulo prende mais que nenhum estado e tem uma maior população prisional, 40% do que existe aqui no Brasil. No entanto, justamente foi isso que gerou essa crise enorme que a gente está vendo, ou seja, uma imensa massa com baixo grau de supervisão, né? Eu queria que o senhor comentasse um pouco esse problema. E, além disso, tem uma outra questão, né, que também consta aqui, a respeito do papel da polícia, se a polícia deve concentrar, né, um outro aspecto. Bom, eu faço essa pergunta depois.
The issue of imprisonment is obviously very important. And I live in the state of Texas, and we're the imprisonment capital of the world, perhaps. And it's also the execution capital of the world. Our politicians believe very firmly in the importance of imprisonment and very severe legal punishments. I think it's very clear that those policies do little or nothing. In fact, to the extent they do anything, they make the situation worse. Todd Clare is a criminologist in the United States who's done some very interesting research in the past few years on the consequences of imprisonment for families and for neighborhoods. And there are entire neighborhoods in the United States where a very large percentage of the males, the adult males, are in prison. And this has enormous effects, negative effects on families and communities, and I would guess very long-term consequences that are very difficult to change. And so the consequences of this lock-em-up policy, as we call it, tend to be more negative, much more negative than positive in this sense. I think that if I could read U.S. culture for a moment, it's not that Americans want to imprison in order to prevent crime so much as simply to gain retribution. That they believe that offenders ought to be punished. Whether it has any positive consequences is irrelevant. They simply want criminals to be punished. If there are positive long-term consequences, good. But if not, that's okay too. And in that sort of cultural climate, it's very difficult to convince people that their efforts to achieve retribution may create more serious problems down the road. So I think there's little doubt that implementation of this very severe criminal justice policy has been dysfunctional more than functional.
A outra questão é sobre o papel da polícia, se a polícia deve se concentrar mais em intervir mais nos incidentes criminais do que propriamente nos ofensores e qual que seria mais negativo ou positivo?
That's a very good question, and I don't know the answer to that. I'll be honest at the outset. Traditionally, the police have, of course, worked more, concentrated their efforts more on offenders than on victims. But increasingly, we recognize, and the police recognize, that they can't ignore victims, and in fact, victims play a very important role in their jobs. For most crimes, at least crimes with identifiable victims, the police rely on victims or representatives of those victims to inform the police that the crime has occurred in the first place. And what comes to mind is rape. If victims are not willing to report their victimization experiences to the police will never learn about the rapes having occurred. And so they have to recognize that and focus some of their efforts, many of their efforts really, on dealing with victim issues. I was in a session yesterday where this came up, and I was saying that in the U.S., prior to about 30 years ago, the vast majority of rape victims did not report their experiences to the police. And they did so because they believed, on the whole, that they would experience further victimization. They'd be brutalized by the police, who would question the extent to which they were somehow involved and responsible for the rape having occurred. Perhaps they had seduced the offender into committing the rape. In many instances, they just didn't believe the victim. And so this became known generally, and most rape victims would not report that experience. The situation has changed over the past 30 years, and mainly because the police have been more responsive to victim needs, to where most rape victims are now reporting their victimization experiences to the police. They have more confidence in the way that the police will respond to this. There's probably still far too little of that for rape and for other offenses as well. There is a movement, though, generally to more effectively or more consistently recognize the importance of victims. Part of the very tough criminal justice policy in the U.S. is attributable to a belief that victims need to be taken into account more than they have in the past. That offender rights, as it's sometimes said, need to be somehow muted in comparison to victim rights. This often emerges as an issue with rape and for other kinds of similar offenses. And the police typically don't do much of that. And in fact, they have difficulty in integrating that into what they do. And I'll give you a simple example. I had another graduate student who did her dissertation research, her PhD research, on how the police responded to the family members of homicide victims. And there was a great problem that the police had in terms of responding humanely, responsibly to the family members of these victims. And there were a couple of problems. One is that in the case of many homicides, family members are often suspects initially, or at least they're among the persons who were investigated most closely initially. And so there's a conflict of interest. There's a conflict in their jobs. So to the extent that they could be understanding with the family members of homicide victims, they would be jeopardizing their investigation of the homicide. At the same time, even when it becomes known that the family members were not in any way involved in the homicide, police officers found it very difficult to handle the emotion of the family members. Police officers, I'm sure this is an overgeneralization, but police officers did not want that emotion mixed into their investigative responsibilities. So what they tended to do was to try to push off those, or push away those family members who were extremely emotional. What's actually been done in many police departments in the United States for this reason is to develop victims assistance units within police departments that actually act as intermediaries between the victims, in this case the surviving family members of victims, and the police, to provide some sort of way of communicating between the two parties, because police members themselves have great difficulty in responding to the emotion that's often attached. The family members of homicide victims, for example, want very much for the investigation of the death of their family member to be the most important thing that the police do. And so in the case of an unsolved homicide, they would like the police to forego any other kinds of investigations and concentrate solely on the investigation of the death of their family member. And they're often quite emotional about this. Well, obviously the police can't do that. They can't respond in the way that the family members often want them to respond. And so they have great difficulty in incorporating these sort of victim responses. And so it's a constant battle, I think, that the police have.
Bom, temos uma outra pergunta aqui para o professor Mark. In your opinion, what is the role of qualitative methodologies in the study of criminality?
I actually talked about this 2 days ago, I think. And I believe there's a very important role for qualitative research. I was trained as a quantitative researcher. My wife and I went to graduate school together, and we were trained to believe that qualitative research was a bad word. And so it's something that I initially had very much a bias. But over time, I began to change my mind, and as I said in a session a couple of days ago, most recently I had an opportunity to do some qualitative research on sex offenders in the United States. And I had never conducted qualitative research of my own. I had had graduate students do so. Dr. Rodriguez had done so, but she knew much more about qualitative research than I did at the time. I didn't really let that be known very much, but in all honesty, that was the case. And so I found that qualitative research was very different than what I had been used to doing, but valuable in many kinds of ways. As I described a couple of days ago, being a quantitative researcher, I tended to start with theory and to deduce predictions that I would then test. And in the qualitative research that I conducted, I found that really wasn't very helpful. I wasn't learning anything new. And so over time, by experience, I began to recognize that one of the values of qualitative research was to generate new ideas that had not been incorporated and tested in previous theories. And so I think it plays a very important role. At the same time, I'm still more comfortable with quantitative research than I am qualitative research, if only because qualitative research, I believe, is much more difficult to do. You have to be much more talented to do qualitative research, and I perhaps just don't have that much talent. It requires an enormous amount of commitment, patience, endurance. The research I conducted required me to attend sex offender treatment group sessions for 11 months. It took 11 months for me to feel like I was really or to believe that I'd really completed the research that I was doing. And that's an enormous investment in time for someone. And I believe that while it's very important, it's something that all researchers cannot do and probably should not do because of that enormous commitment that's involved. At the same time, my own experience with it was invaluable, and I want to do it again. But it's something that's very difficult to do.
Tem duas perguntas aqui que são um pouco mais compridas, que de fato eu vou ler para que o profissional traduz, para que eu não erro na pergunta. A primeira pergunta é como a escola poderia ajudar na prevenção do crime. No Brasil, a escola reflete a sociedade que compõe o universo daqueles alunos e há uma segregação que engessa e perpetua as relações desiguais, mas isso não é um pressuposto para a violência, pois as escolas privilegiadas também possuem índices grandes de violência e as escolas populares possuem índices baixos. Quais as variáveis que a escola pode trabalhar e tentar eliminar?
Well, the situation in Brazil, I guess, is the opposite of the situation in the United States, at least with regard to public versus private. Regardless, there are some very key factors, I believe, in schools, mainly in response to child, or not child killings necessarily, but the school killings in the U.S. a few years ago. The state of Texas took it upon itself to try to find out some of the causes of school violence, and I participated in this, and one of the things I did was to interview students and teachers and parents about what they believed to be the causes of school violence. And one of the things that came across most, at least from our research, was that students in many schools believed that they were anonymous, that they were really unattached to teachers and other students in the schools. This was particularly true, at least among the schools that we visited, in very large schools, where children could fall through the cracks. They really could become invisible to teachers and other students. And that's very much consistent with some of the conventional thinking about the causes of delinquency, that thinking being that children who are strongly bonded to society, who are strongly attached to teachers and school activities, are less likely to violate the law because they have more to lose by doing so. That strong attachment to teachers, let's say, would be jeopardized by violating the law. Well, to the extent that students don't have those strong attachments to teachers, then that, in a sense, frees them to violate the law. And in very large schools in the U.S., this seemed to be one of the things that was operating. That because of the size of the school, teachers and other school officials could not really form strong attachments to all of the students. So some of the students became invisible, and they were the ones who ended up having a higher likelihood of violence. I don't know about the situation in schools in Brazil, but perhaps the same kind of thing could be operating here, perhaps just not in the large public schools in the way I described it in the U.S. We do know that schools segregate. They segregate by age, if nothing else. And as far as crime is concerned, we know that that's a prescription for law-violating behavior. If you bring young people together, especially in unsupervised situations, it increases the likelihood of their law breaking. And so, if I were asked to research why there's more crime, more violence in some schools in Brazil than in others, I would begin to look at those kinds of things. The extent to which students are attached to other students, other teachers. I would also begin to look at the ways they're held responsible or accountable for their misbehavior in schools, because that seems to be a very important factor as well. to the extent that they're unsupervised in these sorts of peer group contexts, I believe that is an invitation for trouble. And that may be part of what's going on here.
Antes que eu coloque a última pergunta que foi entregada à mesa, tem mais alguma pessoa da plateia que gostaria de fazer uma pergunta? Bom, essa também eu vou ler porque é um pouco comprida e eu gostaria que a tradução fosse mais profissional possível. Também tem a ver com violência nas escolas. Diz o seguinte: em uma pesquisa da Unesco, de 2001, sobre violências nas escolas, são comparados 2 grupos de alunos entre 11 e 24 anos. Um conhece fatos de violência na escola, tipo grave, atirar em alguém, roubo e estupro, e o outro não. Para o grupo que relata conhecimento de violência grave, foi encontrado que essas crianças e adolescentes sentem mais tensão no ambiente escolar, dificuldade de concentração e perda de vontade de ir à escola, e tendem a reagir violentamente a uma ofensa com maior frequência que o outro grupo, o qual se queixa com a polícia ou uma autoridade escolar. Sendo assim, podemos considerar que o medo do crime pode ser considerado uma das causas para o aumento da violência.
Yes, I believe it can, and I do believe that is very much a factor in school violence. To the extent that people fear that they'll be victimized by others, they'll tend to avoid those other persons, and that it's relevant for what I said a moment ago. That to the extent that people aren't forming strong bonds, attachments to others around them, other students, other teachers, and so forth, then it's believed this is a way of freeing them to violate the law. And of course, I should add that when people are fearful of being victimized by others, they may respond violently or by committing crimes in the belief that somehow this will prevent their own victimization. So that kind of fear of victimization, I think, is extremely important. It's kind of like an armed camp mentality, that to the extent that you believe that you're going to be victimized, you arm yourself to protect yourself from victimization, and that generally creates even more victimization, even more trouble. At sort of a societal level, that seems to operate in the U.S., and not just in schools, but in the society as a whole. There's an enormous amount of fear of crime in the United States. And as a consequence, many people do literally arm themselves. They do purchase weapons that they keep in their homes, and often in their purses or attached to their bodies in a holster. In the state of Texas, for example, you can carry concealed weapons. This is a new law, but you can actually carry weapons in your purses, or I don't carry a concealed weapon, so I don't know where men carry them. But the consequence of all this is it tends to generate more violence rather than less violence. And so to the extent that this fear generates a tendency to try to protect oneself, that often that makes the situation worse. Many researchers have argued that one of the ways of reducing violence is by reducing fear of crime, by reducing fear of violent victimization. And the process, it's believed, is that it gets people interacting with one another, bonding with one another, and thereby reducing or eliminating the causes of violence in the first place. I visited a school in Austin, Texas, where we live. That's really quite unique, and I was unfamiliar with the school until I went in there to interview some of the students and the teachers. But it's a school really for troubled youth, at least troubled not necessarily in the legal sense, but in a more sociological sense. There were some kids who had violated the law and were required to attend this sort of special school, but there were also children who attended the school because they become pregnant and they had to work, and a conventional kind of school was unworkable for them. There are various reasons why kids were attending this special school. But I'd never been in a school such as this before. And to illustrate, when I first entered, I was to meet with the principal of the school, and she was busy at the moment, and so I was asked to sit in a chair in the hall outside her office. And I was just kind of looking around and taking in the ambiance, and all of a sudden there was an announcement on the loudspeaker about the graduation of a student. And the next thing I knew, teachers and students were coming out of the classrooms, banging cans and ringing bells and things like this. And there was actually a parade through the school honoring this student who had just graduated. They didn't graduate at a particular point in time in mass. They would graduate at different points in time during the year. And this was the time when a particular student had finished her requirements for high school. So they were celebrating this. And one of the things that I was told repeatedly by everyone in the school was there was absolutely no violence, none. That to do so would have almost been an insult to all of the other people in the school, because they were so strongly bonded to one another. And that's very different than most U.S. schools. This is truly an exception, but the exception illustrates the point that I'm making, that if you can achieve that kind of environment in schools, then I think you won't have violence, or you'll at least have very little of it. To take these kids who were troubled in various kinds of ways and to learn that they were committing no violence at all was, to me, very surprising.
Bom, mais alguma pergunta? De alguém da plateia? Bom, então, eu gostaria de agradecer a todos vocês, né, por terem comparecido, e eu gostaria de fechar essa sessão. Também eu gostaria de fazer um aviso. O professor Mark estaria participando em um outro seminário amanhã de manhã, às 9 horas da manhã, na Faculdade de Medicina, que vai acontecer na Salão Nobre da Faculdade de Medicina, e o tema vai ser a racionalidade e a violência. Tem quem gostaria. E também vai ter tradução simultânea. Então, ele vai ter mais uma participação envolvida da Fundação Ford, do IATS e do CRISP. Muito obrigada.
Was the last part what you said?